After D-Day, the Allies were about to lose the war they'd just won. Except they had one incredible trick to bring it back from the jaws of defeat. Here's what they don't tell you about the D-Day landings. Everyone knows about the beaches, the paratroopers, the brave men storming Normandy on June 6, 1944, but almost nobody talks about the disaster that came right after. The Allies had just pulled off the biggest invasion in history, put hundreds of thousands of troops on French soil, and then realized they had no way to keep them alive. No food, no bullets, no fuel, nothing, because you can't just drive a cargo ship onto a beach and start unloading tanks. You need a port, a massive deep-water harbour. And guess what? The Germans controlled every single one on the French coast. So the Allies did something that sounds completely insane. They decided to build their own harbours, pack them up in pieces, drag them across the English Channel during the biggest military operation in human history, and put them back together while the Germans were shooting at them. This is the story of Operation Mulberry, the secret engineering project that actually won World War II. And trust me, you've never heard anything like this before. The date is June 7th, 1944, one day after D-Day. On the beaches of Normandy, Allied commanders are starting to panic. Sure, the invasion worked. Thousands of men made it ashore. But now what? These soldiers need supplies, lots of them. We're talking about 12,000 tons of equipment and supplies every single day just to keep the invasion going. Food, ammunition, medical supplies, spare parts, fuel for tanks and trucks. And that's just to maintain what they already have on the beach. If they want to actually push inland and take back France, they need even more. Some estimates said they'd need up to 15,000 tons per day once the real fighting started. But here's the problem. All of this stuff is sitting on ships in the English Channel. Big cargo ships that can't get close to the beach. Ships need deep water, at least 30 feet. Sometimes more. The beaches? Maybe 6 feet deep at high tide. You can't just sail a cargo ship up to the sand and open the doors. It doesn't work like that. Normally you'd unload at a port, a real harbour with docks and cranes and piers that stick way out into deep water. That's how you move massive amounts of cargo from ship to shore. So why not just use a French port? Because the Germans aren't stupid. They knew the Allies would need ports. So they either destroyed them before retreating, or they still controlled them. Cherbourg, the closest major port to the landing beaches, was still in German hands. And when the Allies finally captured it 3 weeks later, they found the Germans had demolished it so badly it was basically useless. The harbour was filled with sunken ships, mines everywhere, all the cranes destroyed, the docks blown to pieces. It took months to get it working again. The Allies couldn't wait months. They had maybe 2 weeks before their entire invasion force ran out of supplies and had to surrender or retreat back to England. 2 weeks to solve an impossible problem. Actually, they'd been thinking about this problem for 2 years. Back in 1942, British military planners realized that any invasion of France would face this exact issue. You need ports to win wars, but the enemy controls all the ports. It's a classic catch-22. Winston Churchill himself got involved. He wrote a memo to his military chiefs that said, and I'm paraphrasing here, "If we can't capture a port, then we need to bring one with us. Just build our own portable harbour and take it to France." Which sounds ridiculous. Harbours aren't portable. They're made of stone and concrete and metal piers that take years to build. How do you make something like that portable? But Churchill wasn't joking. He wanted his engineers to figure it out. And for the next 2 years, that's exactly what they did. The project was given the code name Operation Mulberry. It was top secret. Only a handful of people in the entire British government knew the full scope of what was being planned. The Germans knew the Allies were planning to invade France eventually. Everyone knew that. But if the Germans found out the Allies were building portable harbours, they'd know exactly where the invasion was coming. Because you only need artificial harbours if you're landing somewhere without a real port. So secrecy was everything. The man put in charge was a British engineer named Hugh Ioris Hughes. He had about 200 other engineers working under him, and together they had to solve a problem that nobody in human history had ever solved before. Build a harbour that could handle the largest ships in the world, could be taken apart into pieces, shipped across the ocean, and then put back together in a war zone. Oh, and it had to survive ocean storms, German bombs, and be ready to use in less than 2 weeks. No pressure. The first problem was the most obvious one. Waves. The English Channel isn't some calm lake. It's one of the roughest bodies of water in the world. Storms come up out of nowhere. Waves can get 15, 20 feet high. Any ship trying to dock in those conditions would just get smashed against the pier and sink. Real harbours solve this with breakwaters, giant walls made of rock and concrete that stick out into the water and block the waves before they reach the docks inside. Without breakwaters, you don't have a harbour. You just have a death trap. So the engineers needed to build a breakwater. But how do you make a breakwater portable? You can't exactly pack up a stone wall and carry it across the channel. They needed something that could float, be towed into position, and then somehow become a solid barrier against the ocean. The solution they came up with was brilliant and totally crazy at the same time. They called them phoenixes. These were enormous concrete boxes, hollow inside, like gigantic rectangular bathtubs made of reinforced concrete. The biggest ones were 200 feet long, 60 feet wide, and 60 feet tall. That's basically a 5-story apartment building lying on its side. Each one weighed 6,000 tons when fully assembled. Here's how they worked. You build these concrete boxes in British harbours, keep them hollow so they float. Then you attach cables and have tugboats tow them across the English Channel. Once they're in position off the coast of Normandy, you open valves at the bottom and flood them with seawater. The boxes sink straight down and settle on the ocean floor. Line up enough of these things side by side, and you've got yourself a breakwater, an artificial wall blocking the waves. But building these things was incredibly difficult. Remember, Britain was in the middle of a war. Resources were scarce. Concrete, steel, labour, everything was needed for 1 million other projects. But the Mulberry Harbours got priority because nothing else mattered if the invasion failed. So all across Britain, in shipyards and dry docks from Southampton to Scotland, workers started building these massive concrete boxes. Most of them had no idea what they were building. They just knew it was top secret and important. They built 146 Phoenix caissons in total. Each one took weeks to construct. And because they were hollow, they were fragile before being sunk. If one cracked or flooded early, it would sink in the wrong place and be useless. The engineers had to be incredibly careful. But the breakwater was only part of the problem. You also need piers, long platforms sticking out from the beach into deep water where ships can pull up alongside and unload. Normal piers are built on concrete pillars driven deep into the seabed. But these piers needed to be portable, and they needed to handle something normal piers don't have to worry about. Tides. The tides in the English Channel are extreme. The water level can change by 20 feet between high and low tide. That means a pier that's at the perfect height at noon might be 20 feet too high or too low 6 hours later. Ships couldn't dock. The solution was called the whale. These were floating roadways made of steel spans connected by joints that let them move up and down with the tide. They rested on steel towers driven into the seabed, but the roadway itself could float, rising and falling with the water level. Ships could dock at any time, and the pier would automatically adjust. Each whale pier was 1 mile long. They built enough sections to create over 10 miles of floating roadway. The steel spans were 60 feet long and weighed 50 tons each. The towers holding them up were 90 feet tall, and all of this had to be designed to come apart into pieces small enough to be loaded onto ships and barges. They also needed smaller floating piers for the ships to actually dock against. These were called beetles. They were basically flat platforms that floated and were anchored in place. Landing craft could pull right up next to them and unload. And then there were the actual ships that would become part of the harbour. The engineers came up with another wild idea. Take old ships that were no longer seaworthy, sail them across the channel, and sink them in a line to create an additional breakwater. Over 70 old ships, everything from rusty cargo vessels to retired warships, were deliberately sunk off the Normandy coast to create a barrier against the waves. It sounds wasteful, but these ships were going to be scrapped anyway. This way they could serve one final purpose. These ships were called the gooseberries. By spring of 1944, everything was ready. Sort of. The engineers had built 2 complete artificial harbours. They were designated Mulberry A and Mulberry B. Mulberry A would go to Omaha Beach, where the Americans landed. Mulberry B would go to Gold Beach for the British and Canadians. Each harbour was designed to be the size of the Port of Dover, one of Britain's busiest harbours. They could handle 7,000 tons of supplies per day and dock up to 12 large cargo ships at once. The cost was staggering. The Mulberry harbours used more concrete and steel than anything else built in Britain during the war. Over 1 million tons of concrete, 70,000 tons of steel. The labour alone involved 45,000 workers. And all of this had to be done in secret, which meant tight security and constant misdirection to confuse German spies. Then came D-Day, June 6, 1944. While soldiers were fighting and dying on the beaches, hundreds of tugboats were already preparing to tow the harbour pieces across the channel. This was almost as dangerous as the invasion itself. The English Channel was filled with German submarines, mines, and patrol boats. The weather was terrible. It was early June, but storms kept rolling through, and these tugs were towing enormous concrete boxes and steel platforms that moved at about 5 miles per hour. It took almost 2 days to cross the channel. The whole time, the crews were exposed and vulnerable. But somehow, it worked. The Phoenix caissons started arriving off Normandy on June 7th, just 1 day after D-Day. Engineers under fire from German artillery started positioning them. They'd use small ships and careful measurements to line them up exactly right, then flood them and watch these massive concrete boxes settle onto the seabed. It was like playing Tetris, but each piece weighed 6,000 tons and you only got one chance to place it correctly. The old ships came next. Crews sailed them into position, opened the seacocks, and abandoned ship. Within minutes, these vessels would list to one side and sink, settling into the mud. 70 ships creating a barrier over 1 mile long. It was eerie watching them go down, one after another, these old warriors finding their final resting place. By June 16th, 10 days after D-Day, Mulberry A at Omaha Beach was partially operational. Ships were already docking at the whale piers. Trucks were driving along the floating roadways, carrying supplies from ship to shore. It was working. The supplies were flowing, thousands of tons per day. And then disaster struck. On June 19th, the worst storm in 40 years hit the English Channel. Nobody saw it coming. This was 1944. They didn't have weather satellites or computer models. Storms just appeared. This one had winds over 60 miles per hour. Waves reached 30 feet. It lasted 3 days. The Mulberry harbours were tough, but they weren't designed for this. At Omaha Beach, Mulberry A was ripped to pieces. The floating piers broke apart. Several Phoenix caissons cracked and collapsed. The anchored ships were torn loose and smashed against each other. When the storm finally passed on June 22nd, Mulberry A was destroyed, completely unusable. The Americans had to abandon it and go back to unloading supplies directly onto the beach, which was slow and dangerous. But Mulberry B at Gold Beach survived. Barely. The British engineers had positioned their caissons more carefully, taking advantage of some natural shelter from the shoreline. They also acted faster when the storm hit, reinforcing weak points and adding extra anchors. When the storm ended, Mulberry B was still standing. Damaged, but functional. The Americans wanted to rebuild Mulberry A. They started salvaging parts from the destroyed harbour to repair and reinforce Mulberry B instead. It made more sense to have one working harbour than two broken ones. So Mulberry B became the lifeline for the entire invasion, the artificial harbour that saved Europe. From June 1944 until the Allies captured real ports later that year, Mulberry B handled over 2.5 million men, 500,000 vehicles, and 4 million tons of supplies. Over 2.5 million soldiers walked through that harbour. Every tank, every truck, every gallon of fuel that powered the Allied advance through France came through that artificial port. In its first 100 days of operation, it handled more cargo than the port of Southampton did in the same period, and Southampton was one of the busiest ports in England. Think about that for a second. British engineers built something in pieces, floated it across the ocean, assembled it in a war zone, and it outperformed a real port that had existed for centuries. That's not just impressive engineering. That's insane. The harbour stayed in use until November 1944. When the Allies finally captured enough real ports to replace it. Then they just abandoned it. Parts of Mulberry B are still there today, sitting off the coast of Arromanches in Normandy. You can see the concrete caissons at low tide, these massive blocks covered in seaweed and barnacles, rusting steel towers sticking out of the water. The French have turned some of it into a museum. You can walk along the beach and see the remains of this crazy project that changed history. But here's what really gets me about this story. The Mulberry harbours weren't just about engineering. They were about refusing to accept that something was impossible. The Allies needed ports. The Germans controlled the ports. Normal military thinking would say, okay, we need to capture a port first, then invade. But that wouldn't work. The Germans would be ready. They'd defend the ports to the death because they knew the Allies needed them. So instead, someone said, what if we just build our own? And everyone else said, that's crazy. And they said, yeah, but what if we try anyway? That's the real lesson of Operation Mulberry. Sometimes the impossible solution is the only one that works. 2 years of planning, 1 million tons of concrete, thousands of workers, hundreds of ships, all for something that most people at the time thought would never work. But it did work, and because it worked, the Allies could keep their armies supplied. They could push inland. They could liberate France and eventually win the war. Without the Mulberry harbours, D-Day might have failed, not on the beaches, but in the weeks after. The soldiers would have run out of bullets and food, tanks would have run out of fuel. The entire invasion force would have been stuck on a few miles of coastline, unable to advance, unable to retreat, just waiting for the Germans to counterattack. And then what? Maybe the war goes on for another year. Maybe 2. Maybe the Germans develop nuclear weapons first. Maybe the Soviet Union conquers all of Europe instead of just half. History turns on these tiny moments, these decisions that seem small at the time but change everything. Operation Mulberry was one of those moments. It was the backup plan that became the main plan, the crazy idea that saved the world. And almost nobody knows about it. They teach D-Day in schools. They make movies about the beach landings. But the harbours, the engineering, the logistics, that gets forgotten. which is kind of crazy when you think about it, because wars aren't won by brave soldiers alone. They're won by supply lines, by the unglamorous work of getting food and bullets and fuel from point A to point B. The Mulberry harbours were that supply line. They were the reason the brave soldiers could keep fighting. There's another angle to this story that's worth mentioning. The Germans actually knew something was up. Their intelligence services reported unusual construction activity in British ports. They saw workers building strange concrete structures, but they couldn't figure out what they were for. Some German officers guessed the Allies might be building parts for artificial harbours, but their superiors dismissed it as impossible. Too complicated, too expensive. It would never work. So they didn't bomb the construction sites. They didn't try to stop the project. They just assumed the Allies were wasting their time. That assumption cost them the war. It's also worth noting that Operation Mulberry wasn't perfect. A lot went wrong. The storm that destroyed WWII wasn't the only problem. Some of the Phoenix caissons cracked during construction and had to be scrapped. Some sank in the wrong place during positioning. The whale piers had mechanical problems. Joints broke. Towers collapsed. Engineers were constantly making repairs under fire. It was chaos, but they made it work anyway through sheer determination and improvisation. The workers who built the harbours had their own stories too. Remember, 45,000 people worked on this project. That's a small city. These were regular people, dock workers, concrete pourers, welders, crane operators. Most of them had no idea they were building something that would help win the war. They just showed up every day, did their jobs, and went home. Some of them died in industrial accidents. Building massive concrete structures is dangerous work. Others were killed when German planes occasionally bombed the construction sites. But they kept working because they knew it was important, even if they didn't know exactly why. After the war, many of these workers found out what they'd built. Some went to Normandy to see the harbours for themselves. Can you imagine that moment? Realizing that the weird concrete box you spent 6 months building was now sitting off the coast of France, part of something that helped defeat Hitler? That must have been incredible. The engineers who designed the Mulberry harbours mostly went back to civilian life after the war. Hugh Ioris Hughes, the chief engineer, continued working on large-scale construction projects until his retirement. He never really got the recognition he deserved. The Mulberry harbours were classified for years after the war. By the time the full story came out, people had moved on. World War II was old news. The engineers just faded into history, even though what they accomplished was extraordinary. So why don't more people know about this? Partly because logistics isn't sexy. Movies are made about soldiers and battles, not supply chains and harbours. But also because the Mulberry harbours were temporary. They served their purpose and were abandoned. There's no monument, no preserved structure you can visit. Just some concrete blocks in the water that most tourists ignore. The story got lost. But it shouldn't be lost, because Operation Mulberry represents something important about how we solve problems. When you're facing something that seems impossible, you have two choices: give up or get creative. The Allies chose creative. They didn't just think outside the box. They built a box, floated it across the ocean, and turned it into a harbour. That kind of thinking is rare. It requires vision, courage, and the willingness to try something that might fail. In a way, the Mulberry harbours were a bigger gamble than D-Day itself. The invasion was risky, sure, but at least they knew how invasions worked. They'd done amphibious landings before. Artificial harbours? Nobody had ever tried that. It was pure innovation under pressure. That's what makes this story relevant today. We're facing our own impossible problems. Climate change, pandemics, whatever comes next. And the lesson from Operation Mulberry is that sometimes the solution isn't to keep trying the same old approaches. Sometimes you need to do something completely new, something everyone says won't work, and then you need to make it work anyway through planning, effort, and refusing to quit when things go wrong. The Mulberry Harbours represent human ingenuity at its finest. They're proof that when we're pushed to the edge, when failure means disaster, we can accomplish things that seem impossible. 2 years of planning. 1 million tons of concrete. Thousands of people working in secret, all for something that existed for less than 6 months, but changed the course of history. That's the power of thinking differently. That's what happens when someone asks, "What if we just build our own harbour?" And everyone else has the courage to say, "Let's try." Want another crazy story about World War II nearly ending the wrong way? Click the video on screen now.